wonderful to have you at this session. It's great for me to see such enthusiasm for a topic that is close to my heart. So I'm Courtney Norbury. I'm going to kick us off here with some housekeeping notes. The first note is it's a pretty packed session. You are welcome to leave, but we just ask that you wait until the speakers have stopped speaking before you move around, if you could. Remember that the sessions are being recorded, so let's be respectful to one another. There is a huge range of understanding and backgrounds in our speakers and our audiences. So you may disagree with what someone says or how they say it, and that is fine. But again, can we please be respectful to one another when we express our opinions? Please do not interrupt the speakers or people asking the questions. We've got, like I said, a tight schedule, so there may be time for one or two questions, but we need to keep it quite brief. Be considerate of everyone around you, and do tweet or follow what's being said on Twitter. Okay, so those are the housekeeping rules. I'm here because I used to be a speech and language therapist, and now I do research primarily on language in lots of different developmental conditions. And I got really interested in autism when I was a PhD student many moons ago. And at the time, the prevailing view around language and autism was that if it was disrupted, that was a consequence of the symptoms that characterized many individuals with autism. And yet what I saw was just this huge range of ability, from some children who had very minimal expressive language to others who were very chatty and could hold conversations and express themselves in really unique and wonderful ways. And so that really made me question what things drive some of that variability. And really then, for those who aren't developing language as we might expect them to, what can we do to support their language development? Because in my other stream of research, what I'm showing is that language is a critical skill for your academic success, for employment, for relationships, even things like leisure activities, going to the cinema or reading books, things like that. So if we want children to be able to advocate for themselves, we need to make sure that they have sufficient language skills to do it. So one of the things that really interests me is how best can we support young children with autism who also have difficulties acquiring the language that they need to be successful. So that's the reason I'm here. I'm going to introduce the speakers, but I'm very delighted that my co-chair is going to keep you all to time. So you need to pay attention to her. This is Kirsten Hurley, so she's going to come up now and say a few words about her interest in this topic.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Courtney. I'm really excited to be here. I think it's so cool that there's two co-chairs, and one is someone who is a researcher and academic, and then someone who is on the spectrum as well. Just a little bit about me. I work in University College Cork in the Republic of Ireland. I'm the coordinator for a project there to make the university autism friendly, and I also lecture on the autism studies programme there. I'm completely obsessed with language. I think it's fascinating. So when I was asked to do this, I was like, this is going to be so much fun. It's not like work, it's brilliant. I was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome when I was 22, and I was actually going into my second year of a degree in Spanish and Chinese. I rarely meet people who are on the spectrum who study languages, which I think is interesting in and of itself. I did a master's then in applied linguistics, and my thesis was on Asperger's syndrome and second language acquisition, so looking at the experiences of people with autism or autistic people learning second languages and what were their own kind of self-reported strengths and challenges in that area. I think it's important to include people with autism in research, but also in the context of learning languages. More than half the world is in a multilingual environment, so it stands to reason then that most autistic people, more than half of autistic people, I don't know the exact figures because no one's really looked at it, but they're going to be operating multilingual environments as well. And we actually have a paper today on this, so I'm really looking forward to that. That's Mélanie. Yeah. And I think it's really important as well to look at the whole idea of language as access, so being able to access information. I was going to talk about a specific example, but I'm going to leave that. But of course, communication is much broader than just access, and I think that's reflected in the range of topics that we have here today. So we're looking at things like relationships, laughter. I saw this paper on laughter. I mean, how cool is that? So we get to examine things like that. Multilingualism, and also this idea of camouflaging. And I think as well, the importance of successful communication is really key to the autistic kind of motto, if that's fair to call it that. This idea of enabling people with autism to have long, happy, healthy lives. So if someone has difficulty with communication, they have more difficulty kind of expressing their health needs to a doctor. So that's going to have impact on lifespan and their health. This idea of accessing information, signposting, that's come up earlier. And then the whole idea of social communication, because that's going to influence relationships and friendships and works and all of that. So it's a really, really important topic.
It is.
And you know, you're in this room, so you obviously think so too. So our first speaker
is yep. So our first speaker is Rebecca Wood, and she's talking about facilitating inclusion through a strength-based model of communication support. And just to make sure you know, you have 15 minutes.
Yes.
And she's right there,
Yes.
so she
Okay.
will give you the indication. Thank you.
Where's it gone? Oh, here we are. Great. Thanks very much for the introduction. So I'm going to talk about some of my PhD research in relation to the inclusion of autistic children in schools, how this links with their very strong interests, and some implications for their communication support in schools. So if we just talk a little bit about school exclusions, first of all, obviously these can be permanent, and when a child is permanently excluded from school, that's obviously very devastating for that child and for the family. But also there's a very significant issue of fixed period exclusions, arguably a bigger problem in certain respects. And this is when a child can be excluded from school for part of the school day, or for a whole day, or for a whole run of days together. And you might not be aware that an individual child can be excluded for a maximum of 45 days within a single school year. And if the minimum number of school days in a school year is 190, and the majority of schools actually stick to more or less that minimum, then a child can potentially be missing an awful lot of schooling. And in the sort of mainstream media narrative, there tends to be an assumption that exclusion from school refers to mainstream schools, but actually special schools exclude children, as do pupil referral units. So pupil referral units are small schools that children go to, often when they've been excluded from a number of other schools, and they tend to represent the end of the line educationally. So I've got some data here from the Department for Education just to exemplify this point. So this is on fixed period exclusions for all pupils between 2016 and 2017. And on the left, I've got state-funded primary, secondary and special schools. Then I've got primary, secondary and special academies. Then on the right, I've got pupil referral units. So these are the fixed period exclusion rates. And you can see that as far as primary schools were concerned, they were more or less the same for those which are state-funded and those which were academies. Same for state-funded secondary schools and secondary academies. For state-funded special schools, the rate was at approximately 13%, and for special academies, the rate was higher at over 15%. And of those special academies, there were 216 during this time period, 36 were sponsored, and that means that they're run by an academy trust that might run one school or several schools, bearing in mind that these are all special schools. The fixed period exclusion rate was at 47.89%. And obviously for PRUs, of which there were 330 during this time, it's very high. Now this is a relatively simple, superficial, if you like, reading of these figures. You're not comparing like with like. For example, there are far more state-funded primary schools than there are primary academies, for example, or special schools in particular. Nevertheless, I think what we can safely say is that exclusions is not just an issue that applies to mainstream schools. So it's important to approach these sorts of data with caution, and also it's very important to use other sources too. often when you read data on school exclusions, or reports on school exclusions, they will rely solely on data from the Department of Education, but actually it's important to use additional sources. And this sort of data, or these sorts of data, can inform research questions of primary data collection. They can sort of set up the idea that there's some sort of a problem which primary data collection can seek to find answers to, and that was certainly the case in my study. Now, another important point is that there are lots of forms of internal exclusion, and this was certainly an issue in my study. So autistic children not taking part in after-school clubs, not doing the whole curriculum, not being in the classroom, not taking part in school trips, not being with a qualified teacher because they spend the whole day with a teaching assistant. And there's also the issue of self-exclusion or withdrawal, where a child refuses to go to school because of anxiety or stress, because their needs are not being met. This wasn't particularly a feature in my study, but certainly I think my findings have implications for that issue. And of course, having access to education is linked to a range of positive longer-term outcomes. To be excluded from school means one is much less likely to have positive outcomes in the longer term. And so this shows that anything we can find to address this issue, we need to take seriously. And of course, as we've been hearing at different points today, autistic children and young people have very impoverished health, employment and well-being outcomes in the longer term. So if I turn to my study now, so I spent 5 months in 5 mainstream primary schools, and my participants consisted of school staff, autistic children, parents and autistic adults. And I used a mixed methods, this is a mixed methods study, particularly as far as the children were concerned. And my data were analysed through thematic analysis, and I ended up with 8 interlinked themes, of which communication and interests were 2 themes. So if we turn now to the issue of special interests, I'm sure you know the term, and it relates to having a very strong interest in a particular area of focus and being pretty unwilling to kind of look at other things or think about other things. And the DSM-5 states that the severity of autism is predicated on the extent to which restrictive, repetitive patterns of behaviour, interests or activities are demonstrated. And this very key central autistic trait tends to be presented negatively in the literature, and the vocabulary used to describe this trait reflects that negativity. So terms such as fixations, obsessions, unusual interests, restricted, narrow, circumscribed. And this trait has also been linked to OCD, as well as unwanted repetition and perseveration, sticking at something and not desisting from it. However, particularly within the autistic research community, there's been a more positive framing of this trait, which has been going on for a long time, actually for decades, called monotropism, or an interest model of autism. And certainly the research literature shows that within educational contexts, when autistic children can access their very strong interests, there are mainly positive effects. There are some negative ones, as I also found, but they're mainly positive. In fact, in my study, I found a whole raft of benefits when the autistic children were able to access their very strong interests: improved communication, better inclusion and sense of belonging to the school community. They were a way of coping with school, and they were also linked with perfectionism, attention to detail, and with expertise and with positive future plans. So we can already see a possible indicative link here between the children being able to access their interests, being included in school, and positive longer-term outcomes. So a boy who I called Marcus, who was aged 9, in our interviews, he was quite taciturn and hesitant. He seemed frustrated. He found it difficult to find his words, and he found open questions especially difficult. However, when I asked him what his favourite activity was in school, he lit up and started telling me about coding club, which he said was epic. And I asked, why is it epic? And he said, because you get to do like coding and make games. Fantastic, I said. And he said, I made this epic game. It's called Pixel Rush. It's so cool. What's cool about it? I asked. And he said, well, it means you have to try to get to the diamond, and once you've fallen like a spike, you failed the level. So you can see from this short extract that he has no problem with open questions. Why is it epic? What's cool about it? He offers information. I say fantastic, he tells me something about it. And here, compared with other parts of our interviews, his answers are longer, he's employing a broader lexis, and he's less inclined to trip over his words. And in fact, Marcus was the only child out of the 10 children in my study to attend a regular activity out of main school hours, coding club, which was an after-school club. None of the other children attended after-school clubs or breakfast clubs for various reasons. A girl who I've called Lucy, who was age 7, she was similarly quite hesitant in interviews, perhaps not to the same extent as Marcus, and she was also quite kind of taciturn and subdued in some maths activities as well. However, during a reading activity where she had a book about snakes, and this had a very high visual content, but also a lot of text, she was completely different. She was very talkative, she was enthusiastic, she said wow a few times. In fact, she exhibited a whole range of aptitudes, such as reading out loud, she was finding synonyms when she was asked to, she was asking questions spontaneously, does the milk snake drink milk? She was paying attention to detail, she was commenting spontaneously and on requests on the text, the sunbeam snake is so shiny. She was relating the book to her own experiences watching films about snakes at home, and she was also engaged in independent silent reading. In fact, she was demonstrating a range of what have been described as high-level reading skills in this activity, and these specific skills have been linked to positive education, health and employment outcomes in the longer term. So again, we see a kind of indicative positive link between strong interest, inclusion in school, and possible good outcomes in the longer term. Some of the staff said that when they worked with the very strong interests of the autistic children, it was the linchpin to their overall educational inclusion. One deputy head teacher said that Valentin, a boy I've called Valentin, was transformed when some staff did some work with him on planets. And she said, a good teacher will know to throw the plan in the bin and run with this. And also, when some of the non-autistic adults described autistic people, they tended to use quite othering language sometimes. One teacher said that when she learnt that a particular autistic boy was due to join her class, she was worried because she perceived him as an extreme child. However, soon after he joined her class, she discovered that they both shared a very strong interest in Disney films. And she said, he's now my absolute favourite child I have ever taught. I can chat to him about The Princess and the Frog. I'm into that sort of thing too. If he comes in singing a song from a Disney film, I know what it is, and I start singing with him. In some ways, we're on the same wavelength. I'm very Disneyfied. So rather than seeing this boy as sort of extreme and different and somebody to be kind of feared, they actually had a special bond. She had a special bond with him she didn't share with any other child. However, there were some disadvantages to this trait as manifested within the school environment. It's very important to acknowledge those, although I think there are explanations for them. And these were particularly, some staff felt it was a barrier to curriculum inclusion. I've only got time just to give you one example of the disadvantages. So Alex's mother said that she felt that friendships were the key to her son's happiness in school, but she said, I'm hoping he's going to learn that he can't be so selfish. He can't just talk about what he wants to talk about or play with what he wants to play with. Overall, I found that when the autistic children were able to access their very strong interests in school, there were a range of inclusionary benefits, including their communication and socialisation. And this trait has been associated with flow and well-being in the longer term, and with expertise and positive outcomes. And I think that the negative effects of these very strong interests as manifested in school could in part be explained by the stresses of the school environment. There was certainly evidence in my study that when the children were feeling stressed and under pressure, they were sort of resorting to their interests as a source of comfort. It's one explanation anyway. However, fear of academic failure can mean that pupils' motivations are ignored. If the curriculum of an autistic child is set according to their perceived deficits, communication, social interaction, etc., it can mean that they actually have less access to what they're very interested in and motivated by. There are a number of implications for communication support within schools. It's important to, I think, identify the child's interests, to focus on what they're good at, and to look at using strength-informed models of assessment. And these have been shown to be particularly useful for very young children who have limited speech. to set aside the impairment model of communication support and to focus instead on the shared interactive nature of communication and to find like-minded peers for that child. And it's a huge issue and very, very complex, but there must be an awareness of the high degrees of stress that a lot of children, autistic children, experience in school and to try to reduce those. I have a paper on communication in the Educational Review if you're interested in reading some more. And I also, specifically on interests, have a paper also in the Educational Review, and this is free to download just for the next few days until the end of June. And I also have a book coming out in August, which has got covers these issues in more detail. Thank you. Was I to time?
Brilliant. So are there any questions for Rebecca? Yes.
Thank you. It was really interesting that you said that the children were kind of doing better when it was in the realm of their special interests.
Yeah.
Do you think that those interests can be encouraged or developed by teachers and therefore kind of manipulated to improve school outcomes?
Yes, in a word. I mean, which is not to say that it's easy. I mean, for starters, my findings are based in primary schools where I think there's more flexibility. I used to be a secondary school teacher myself, so I'm aware that it's a bit more complex within a secondary school setting. But certainly some of the staff in my study, they sort of tuned into this already, and they found that they could set assessment activities and socialisation activities around the child's interest, so it really facilitated their inclusion.
Any other questions? Yes.
In this presentation you talked about the child having a special interest as being largely positive if that's then sort of manipulated into their education.
Yeah.
But then you had also a quote from a parent who said that they were worried that this showed selfishness in the child,
Yeah.
and then that might hinder their relationships
Yeah.
with their peers.
Yeah.
So could you maybe talk a little bit about how that parent's view and how it could be the social aspect of it?
Well, it wasn't a big part of my study, but what I would say is that when the children in my study had support for social skills, like they would go to a social skills group or something like that, the assumption tended to be that they would be placed with like-minded peers, not like-minded peers actually, typically developing peers, and the idea was that they would sort of benefit from their social skills. Whereas I think in this context, as I said at the end there, finding like-minded peers or having activities around the child's interests could potentially work. It might not, but I think in some areas it could definitely work. I mean, it's not a straightforward issue. It's a complex issue, and there aren't easy answers with it. But I think there's certainly a lot of evidence to suggest that we need further exploration of this issue, for sure.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Yeah, drawing on for this, I think there is a peculiar way in which autistic people and other disabled people are sort of treated as somehow exceptions. Obviously, so-called normal, non-disabled children, adults, people socialise with others with common interests, or sometimes with people in the workplace. And they, that's why you have so many sort of, all sorts of things. But it is somehow assumed that autistic people need to be forced into interacting with people that they're not, and I think there is some evidence that the subject of the interaction is probably more important for autistic people than non-autistic people. And last, since I'm here, just a brief plug, I have not really quite totally my subject, but I have a paper from interviews with Polish teachers of autistic children in advances in autism.
Brilliant. I think you make a good point. Having a child in primary school myself, I can tell you that social interaction is always a bit of an issue. And for sure, when I was listening to you, I wondered whether you'd interviewed any non-autistic children, because I think some of the things you're pointing out would be true of all children.
Yeah.
So if you're talking to them about things that they're interested in or they have expertise in,
May I?
you tend to get more
Yeah.
advanced language
And
as well.
what I explain in the broader paper is absolutely that point, which
Right.
is that if you look at the research literature about all children and whether or not they are motivated and interested and engaged, there are lots of positive effects, as you might expect. And so I think there are lessons here which could apply to all children.
Yeah. The challenge for teachers is managing 30 of them
Yeah,
at
of
the
course,
same
yeah.
time. Right, thank you very much. That's really good food for thought. And the next speaker is Catherine Crompton, who is going to talk about autistic adults' relationships with autistic and neurotypical friends and family.
So we wanted to know a little bit more about the real world experiences of autistic adults and what it's like for them when they're spending time with other autistic people and when they're spending time with non-autistic people. So we have a lot of first person accounts that have described what this can be like for individual autistic people. But as researchers, we wanted to look at this in a more systematic way by asking a bigger number of autistic people the same questions to see if we could see any similarities in their experiences. So I've only got 10 minutes today to talk about this piece of research, so it's going to be a very quick tour of what our main findings are and how we did this research, but we are hoping to have a paper out on this in the next couple of months, so there will be more information in there if you want it. So in order to find out more about autistic people's experiences of spending time with autistic and neurotypical friends and families, we did some one-to-one interviews with 12 autistic adults. The interviews lasted about an hour and they were done in person, on Skype chat, or on the phone, just depending on whatever the participant preferred. And these are some of the questions that we asked. So to start, we asked participants who they spend the most time with in their day-to-day life, who are the important autistic and non-autistic people that they spend time with. We talked about how they know them and how they met, how much time they spend together, and the types of things that they enjoy doing when they're together. And we asked about some of the good things about spending time with people and some of the challenges about spending time with people. And we asked how they felt when they were together and why they thought that was, and how they felt after they'd spent time together and why they thought that was. So as I said, we did the interviews with 12 autistic adults. They all had a clinical diagnosis of autism, mostly diagnosed in adulthood. And our group had a mean age of 33.5, but the ages kind of ranged across the kind of middle-age spectrum of 21 to 51. And we used thematic analysis to explore the interviews. And what that means for people who aren't familiar with the term is we look for themes in what people are saying to us. So we listen to the interviews again, we go through the transcripts, and we identify little similarities between the things that people are saying, and then we cluster these similarities into themes. And we found 3 main themes from these interviews. So first was cross-neurotype difficulties. Secondly was minority status, and thirdly was belonging. So I'm going to explain what I mean by these themes, and I'll give you some illustrative quotes and examples of the kinds of things that people have said. So, firstly, cross-neurotype difficulties. So what we mean by this is that autistic people found it difficult to communicate and understand neurotypical people, and that they felt that neurotypical people found it difficult to communicate with and understand them too. So this manifested in feelings of anxiety when spending time with neurotypical people, and feeling that neurotypical interaction with neurotypical people takes more effort and that there are more misunderstandings. Autistic people also told us that they are more emotionally fatigued after spending time with neurotypical people, that it was just really tiring. And this was alongside feelings that neurotypical people aren't very good at reading autistic emotions or understanding how people are feeling or understanding their intentions very well, and that neurotypical friends and family aren't very good at empathizing with autistic people. So here are 2 quotes to illustrate this theme. So one person said, "I'm tired afterwards. It's not that it's bad, it's just tiring. It takes effort to be around them." I should say them as neurotypical people. "I am always thinking about it. I am always, should I speak now? What should I say? Has this moved on? Is that okay? Is this appropriate? Will that offend someone? And who is speaking and what are they saying and do they really mean that?" And someone else said, "I do like my neurotypical friends, but oh, they make me tired. They don't understand me. Even if it's good, it's exhausting." So the second theme was autistic people feeling that they were in a social minority when they were spending time with others. So this theme was made up of different components that included autistic people saying that sometimes their neurotypical friends and family wanted to do social activities when they were spending time together that weren't autism friendly and that caused them to feel awkward or discomfort. Autistic people also said that they were expected to behave neurotypically when they were around their neurotypical friends and family and to suppress their autisticness. And because of this, they said that people then developed neurotypical expectations of them. And this led to feelings of frustration from the autistic people, both directed at the neurotypical people that they were spending time with for not understanding their needs, but also directed at themselves for not being able to cope with, quote, normal things that everybody else can. So here's another couple of quotes to illustrate this theme of feeling in a social minority. So if I'm surrounded by lots of neurotypical people, I can't let all my autisticness out. I feel really annoyed at myself because it is a really normal thing to go to the pub with your friends. But I find it really hard and I really don't like it, but I wish I did. And the third and final theme relates to autistic people feeling belonging within an autistic community with their autistic friends and family. So we heard from autistic people that it's easier for them when they're interacting with other autistic people, that it's effortless, and they feel comfort and alignment with other autistic people, and that they have a shared understanding. They feel empathy and tolerance towards other autistic people, and they've experienced people being empathic and tolerant towards them. And after spending time together, they feel less tired than they did when they spent time with neurotypical people. And autistic friends and family could give them autism-specific advice. And they felt that this kind of being around other autistic people was really beneficial for their mental health. So here are a few quotes on our final theme of belonging. So firstly, when I first self-diagnosed and I started finding blogs and autistic people on Twitter, it blew my mind that there were all these people out there who just got me. I didn't have to explain stuff, they just got it because they lived it too. I kept wanting to shout, I have found my people. Being with my autistic friends is like entering another realm. It's full of colour and ideas, and normal rules and conventions don't apply. I don't even try and suppress my meanness in autistic spaces. It's a beautiful thing. I'm like a butterfly spreading its wings. I never realised that everybody felt as at ease and as happy as I do when I am around autistic people. And specifically on the importance of autistic spaces and mental well-being, we have these kind of quotes. So I'd like to see more approaches to supporting autistic people based on providing autistic space for them. I think there'd be a lot of positive long-term mental health and quality of life outcomes. It's very important to have autistic space for people. Sometimes people fear this is a form of self-siloing or segregation, and I'm not trying to say we don't need to survive in the non-autistic world too, but it's such a lifeline for many of us. And so what does this mean, kind of more broadly? So as I said earlier, we've had autistic people telling us their first-hand experiences of spending time with their autistic and neurotypical peers, and this research wanted to just explore that in a more systematic way. And we found kind of key themes that illustrate that there are benefits of autistic people creating and maintaining social relationships with autistic people. And we've shown this in a kind of more systematic way than previous reports. And we think that these results highlight the need for autistic-led social opportunities and indicate potential benefits of informal peer support for autistic adults. So I just want to end with a big thank you to our team, Sue, Danny, Emma, Claire, Coz, Sunny. A huge thank you to everybody who participated and to our funders and to you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very clear presentation. Are there any questions? Oh, yes, in the scrap sheet. I don't know how that works for the filming. She's asking, can we turn the lights off? Turn them down a little, but it might affect the filming otherwise. Sorry. Are there any questions about the presentation?
Yeah.
Please.
I'm interested in the fact that my experience of a parent of a child who's autistic is that there was a massive push to engage her in working and being with neurotypical people. I've only discovered kind of what you've just said kind of fairly recently for her, and I just wonder how we can support young people to find their own social group within say for instance an educational setting, so that all the things you've taught about there and how it improves kind of just being who you are, when in fact what we do is push people into being with people who all those stresses actually just exacerbate a lot of the stress and distress. And I just wondered what's your thoughts on that in terms of school stuff particularly?
Yeah, no, I really agree. I think if it's, kind of interventions and supports that are entirely based around teaching autistic people how to behave neurotypically are just going to ramp up anxiety and really kind of negative self-feelings. And I think it's really important to make sure that we're creating these spaces for kids to spend time together with people who are like them, where they can just relax and be themselves. I don't do a huge amount of work with children and young people or with schools. It's definitely not my area, but schools have all kinds of clubs. You would hope that they would be able to facilitate something that might really improve the well-being of a group of their kids. So I'm not entirely sure how that would be done, but it's the kind of thing that doesn't take a huge resource, a huge amount of time or money. So you'd be hopeful that, if we can keep building the evidence base for this being a positive thing for people, that hopefully then there will be changes in practice. Thank you.
I'm going to ask for someone from this side of the room, if that's okay. Vicky?
I didn't say as a clinician who spent many years running social skills interventions, we stopped, and we stopped really for a lot of the reasons that have been said. And one of the things that we now feel confident to say to parents is that your child will make friends when they find people who share the same interests. So going back to the talk before. And I think that's reassuring, because actually quite a lot of people that we met with autism didn't particularly want to be friends with the people that we surrounded them with. But as soon as they were with people that shared interests or communicated in a similar way, they made genuine and reciprocal friendships. And one of the things I get anxious about is a lot of research, particularly in the States, on manipulating the social environment to have this goal of friendships, when actually I think that we forget that there are negative side effects, genuine negative side effects to social manipulation. And one example would be buddy systems. If you don't mind, this is a bugbear of mine. Buddy systems, when you're allocated a child, play with each break. And if you're not very socially savvy, then you think that person is your friend, but the next day they aren't, because they're playing with their friends. And if you're more socially savvy at that age, you recognise that you've been allocated to somebody, and both are very, very negative experiences. So in any other treatment, you'd recognise, if it's a medication treatment, that you could have negative side effects. And I don't see much published research looking at the negative side effect of these social interventions. So I think it's two messages. One is people make friends with people they share interests with, which is exactly what we said before. And two, there are negative side effects to social manipulation.
Yep. Brilliant. Good. Great.
Thank you.
And thank you,
Brilliant.
Catherine, very
Thank you.
much. So now we're going to have Laura Crane give the talk for Lucy Henry on the narrative coherence of witness transcripts in children on the autism spectrum. Thank you for standing in, Laura.
Thank you. Don't know what she's named her slide.
Okay, I'm a very, very last minute stand-in for Lucy. I got the slides 10 minutes ago, and I probably won't be able to answer any of your questions, but hopefully I can give you a summary of what we did in our study. And this is part of a much broader study looking at how children on the autistic spectrum fare as witnesses. So we've looked at how they cope when they're interviewed by police, how they cope when they're asked to identify perpetrators, when they're cross-examined by barristers, and when they're evaluated by a jury. And today this focuses on some of our interview work, focusing in particular on the narrative coherence of what children say. So in terms of what we know about the witness skills of autistic children, generally they tend to recall less information than their typically developing peers, but importantly what they do say does tend to be accurate. Most studies in the past have tended to look at the amount of information children recall rather than what they say or how they say it. And this is what we've focused on in this particular analysis. So as part of the study, this is just a subset of it, we have 52 autistic children and 52 typically developing children who all witnessed an event, either in their school assembly or they watched it on a computer, and we took that into account when we did our analyses. It was a mock minor crime, so we had two men come in, give an assembly about school in Victorian times, and they had a little minor altercation as part of that. The children themselves were all of primary age, and they had cognitive abilities in the typical range. Later that day, we simulated the situation where a police officer might come in and ask a child what they remembered about what they saw. And then we analysed those initial interviews. We looked at the volume of information they recalled and the accuracy of that, but we also looked in a bit more detail using a story grammar framework. So these are different elements of a narrative, looking at, for example, settings. So did they give contextual information about what was going on? Did they initiate the event, so talk about how it started and give that background? Did they talk about their internal feelings, the intentions of the people there, the actions that took place, the outcomes of that, and then the resolution, so what happens at the end? And we coded their narratives for each instance of these story grammar elements. And I should say this has come from previous research, and we've just adapted this framework for the criminal justice context. And what we found was that, as consistent with previous research, the autistic children tended to recall less information than their typical peers. But when we looked at these story grammar elements, actually they were equivalent to the typical comparison group across all of these measures. So they may have recalled less, but actually they were able to give this contextual detail. They talked about internal responses to a similar degree, the actions, they ended the story, etc. So overall, what we can conclude is that it adds to a growing body of evidence that the narratives of autistic children can be equivalent to their typically developing peers. They may recall less, but actually that evidence does tend to be good. So we can consider them to be reliable and informative witnesses. And I'll just stress again, these were autistic children who were of a cognitive ability similar to their typical peers. We didn't look at children with additional intellectual disability who might need more support in this context. Both groups had scope for maturation in these elements, and we do expect them to develop, so we don't know what happens later on in development. But it does show some areas of comparability between autistic and typically developing children in their witness narratives. And this could be useful in the criminal justice context, especially within the new role in the justice system of the registered intermediary, who supports communication between vulnerable witnesses and members of the justice system, and who do these cognitive assessments and these language assessments to really identify the areas that the children may struggle with or need more support with. And if you want to find out more about our project, this is our website, which gives details about the broader study as well as this one.
I think you did a fantastic, admirable job there. Maybe one question will
And I'll
test
try to
Laurie,
answer.
see if she can answer. Yeah.
This is a technical question, I'm sorry.
Okay.
What was your sample size?
In this particular analysis, we compared 52 autistic children who were compared to 52 typically developing children. But as part of the broader study, we had 248 in total, but we wanted these groups to be carefully matched. So in previous research on story grammar, we do see quite conflicting results, with some studies showing autistic children performing poorer than their peers, others showing them to be comparable. And what we feel is that actually if you match children quite carefully on their receptive language ability and on their IQ, actually they are comparable. So this was the key thing in our study. We really wanted to match the groups very, very well.
I have one suggestion, which is that you do an equivalence test or a Bayes factor analysis so that you can show equivalence rather than just no difference.
I will certainly suggest that to Lucy. Thank you very, very much.
And do you have plans to look at kids who don't have age-appropriate language skills? Because I would guess they're the really vulnerable ones, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why this registered intermediate role is so helpful in particular, to really work out what their challenges are. I think in future, absolutely, it'd be great to look at how we can better support their performance in the criminal justice system.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. Okay, so unfortunately Mark Gibson is not with us, so Mélanie, you might have to say your surname for me.
Gréaux.
Gréaux. It sounds much better when you say it.
One. That's fine. That's fine. I'm used to
It's
it.
going to talk to us about speech and language therapy for multilingual autistic children.
Alright, so hi, my name is Mélanie and I'm a first year PhD student at the University of Cambridge, and my talk is all about speech and language therapy for multilingual autistic children. Very briefly but very importantly, I want to acknowledge my supervisors, Jenny Gibson and Apollon Katzos, and also the incredible support I received from Autistica, which is making it very special for me to be here today. So I only have 5 minutes to talk to you today, or maybe a bit more if there was someone that was...
You better take the time.
Okay, I'll do my best. So there are 3 key messages that I want to convey today: the benefits of speech language therapy for autistic children, but the challenges that speech language therapists face when they have to provide services for linguistically and culturally diverse autistic children. And finally, I'd like to suggest a couple of suggestions. So the benefits, as I'm pretty sure you're all very aware of, autistic children and individuals in general can present with very complex and varied communication needs. Social communication difficulties are part of the diagnostic criteria for autism, but there's also a very high level of co-occurrence with other language and communication difficulties. So speech and language therapists offer that expertise to support individuals with a wide range of speech, language and communication disorders, so that's very relevant to a lot of those children. Then there's starting to be a growing body of literature evidencing the positive outcomes of speech language therapy, so there's still not that much there, but it's growing. We've heard of PACT this morning. There's also PECs and other interventions. So short-term positive outcomes, but we can also expect the potential for very long-term positive outcomes, because functional language and communication abilities in autistic adults are some of the best predictors of enhanced quality of life. And last but not least, the autistic community has identified interventions for language and communication as some of their priorities for autism research. So there's really a need to look into that. However, as I said, speech language therapists encounter a lot of different limitations and challenges when they're faced with linguistically and culturally diverse populations. And that applies not just to autism, but to any speech, language, and communication disorders. First of all, there's limited research looking at the intersection between language disorders and multilingualism. So autism research usually focuses on monolingual children, and bilingualism research looks at neurotypical individuals. But there's very little at the intersection between the two, making it very difficult to have the evidence-based practice that we are hoping for. Then there's quite a lot of linguistic and cultural barriers that speech language therapists face when they have families come to them and there might be some miscommunication, misunderstandings around the hopes for therapy, or when providing information and directing the therapy aims. And finally, there's quite a lot of studies that have recorded some of the difficulties to adapt the assessments and intervention approaches for this population. So for example, if you're working with an interpreter to assess language communication skills, how do you work with them? There's very few and limited guidelines around that. When you get those results, how do you interpret that in a language that you don't even know? There's very limited resources to do that. And in interventions, do you do it in one language or in the other language, or do you use a combination of things? Lots of open questions for the therapy for those children. So some of the solutions that I'd like to suggest to you, but I'm very open to your suggestions as well, is maybe to look at cross-cultural collaboration between speech-language therapists from different cultures, obviously, to inform practice, to be able to share knowledge around language norms, for example, in different languages, or to share resources. Maybe there are assessments or interventions that we could import in England or export to other communities and really facilitate that knowledge exchange. Then, also looking at more collaboration between researchers, practitioners, and the autistic community to increase the potential of research to actually have real-life impact. That's something that is coming up a lot in this conference, and I'm very pleased to hear that a lot of researchers are really trying to encourage more participatory research, which is amazing. And then another suggestion would be to start developing more specific multilingual guidelines. So speech-language therapists have guidelines on how to adapt their approach for multilingual clients, but they might not be very specific. Bless you. They might not be very specific around the condition or very different aspects of speech, language, and communication. So really looking into that. So the key message is speech and language therapy has huge potential, I believe, and I feel very passionate about that. But there are very significant limitations when they have to provide services for multilingual children. And I really strongly believe that we need more practice-based research, but also participatory and cross-cultural to really inform best practice. Oh, done. Oh, I'm done.
Oh, no, sorry, I didn't realize.
You sure? Okay. Well, very briefly, this is what I intend to do for my PhD. I still have 2 months to finalize it, so if you have suggestions, I'm very open to that. So I'm hoping to look at mutually beneficial cross-cultural knowledge exchange to foster evidence-based practice for multilingual autistic children, and I'd like to compare speech language therapist practice in England and in India, and I'm going to use a mixed methods design. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Any questions for Mélanie? Why India, Mélanie? Apart from it's a nice place to visit.
No, that's a very good question. Well, there's a very strong Indian community here in the UK, so that there was a very strong predictor. But there was also a Polish community, which is very predominant here in the UK, or Pakistani, and that's for more logistic reasons, really, for them. But yeah, Punjabi, Urdu, and Bengali are the 3 mostly spoken languages that we find in schools in the UK, and they're all spoken in India. So I think we could find some very interesting resources of it.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I will be very interested to see how that turns out. And yes.
Yes, it's really, really interesting what you're doing. So I work for NHS England, so having seen it in clinical practice, actually, where the cultural differences really make a difference when it comes to delivering the therapy. So I'm really excited about what you're doing.
Thank you.
So I'd love to hear more of what you do in the future and how to get hold of you.
Okay, very good, thank you. Yeah, maybe later when I get my data.
Brilliant, and good luck with your study.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so Thomas. This is Thomas Cawthorne. who is going to tell us about differences in observed and reported emotional and behavioural problems by developmental level. Thank you, Thomas.
Hi, I'm Tom. I'm from King's College London. So what this kind of research was basically on is looking at kind of children who are currently minimally or non-verbal and children who are verbal, who are autistic, and looking at the differences in what parents and teachers report in terms of the emotional behavioural difficulties, and then comparing that to the differences that we see when they come in and do a kind of structured interaction with us. So kind of, as we all kind of know, autistic individuals both with and without intellectual disability have increased rates of mental health problems. There are some studies that find that kind of parents with verbal autistic children report kind of high levels of internalising and conduct difficulties, with some parents of minimally verbal autistic children reporting high levels of ADHD and hyperactivity, but this is kind of really quite mixed. However, none of these studies use objective measurement and rely almost entirely on parent report measures or occasionally kind of teacher report or self-report. So there's a few problems with this. Firstly, obviously, then we're relying on whoever's filling the questionnaires in perception of the children's behaviour. And secondly, there's something called, I think it's common method effects, where basically if we get someone to fill in loads of different questionnaires, they can fill them all in quite similar ways, and that's not necessarily reflective of the situation. So the data from this study was drawn from a randomised control trial at King's College London, testing a new intervention, a new parenting intervention regarding kind of emotional behavioural difficulties in 4 to 8 year old autistic children. And approximately half the children were verbal, meaning that they were kind of module 3 on the ADOS, which is a structured assessment that we do. And approximately half of the children were currently non or minimally verbal and were module 1. So what we did is we got the parents and teachers to fill in kind of several different questionnaires, as we can kind of see there in green. And we also did something that we developed called the OSCAR, which is a novel measure of parent-child interaction and emotions and behaviours of concern that we specially developed for autistic children. So the OSCAR is comprised of kind of 8 tasks. 2 are researcher-led and 6 are parent-led. So it involves things like parents and children playing on a Bop-It together, doing the homework, drawing on an Etch-a-Sketch, different activities like that, as well as kind of tidying away and separation. There were slight subtle differences between the activities done by the group that was currently minimally verbal and the verbal group, but they were kind of equivalent. So for example, whilst the verbal group would play with a Bop-It with 4 different arms, the minimally verbal group was playing with a toy where there was kind of only 1 button, but all the tasks were kind of equivalent. So when we're kind of looking at the results in terms of what the parents and teachers reported, there's not really anything that interesting at all. So essentially, for both the verbal and the minimally verbal groups, the parents and the teachers were reporting kind of the same. There's not really a difference between the minimally verbal group and the verbal group of children. However, when we look at what we observed in terms of the frequency of behaviours of concern, it was over twice as frequent in the minimally verbal group, which is obviously really quite significant. This isn't a kind of a subtle difference. This is something that's kind of really quite obvious, and it was like highly significant difference as well. So in terms of why there is this difference, so obviously one possibility is that it was a non-equivalent measure. However, firstly, we kind of developed it in kind of collaboration with parents of autistic children as well as autistic adults as well. And I think it was kind of concluded that there was a lot of kind of similarities between the activities that we did with the different groups. And also, if it was that kind of situation, you would also expect the parents maybe of the minimally verbal children to report a lot higher levels of kind of difficulties when they go about their everyday life as well, because this situation wasn't massively different. A second possibility, which is kind of relating to the environment but also the kind of children themselves, is that, as other studies have found, kind of minimally verbal children often have high levels of impulsivity and ADHD, and also maybe lower levels of social awareness. So therefore, maybe it's that the children who were in the verbal group, kind of it was coming into this meeting new people, they were kind of a bit aware that there was something going on, that people were watching them, they'd maybe have to behave a bit differently and maybe could inhibit their behaviour for this period of time, whereas the minimally verbal group wasn't able to do that. However, on the same day that we did this assessment, we also did interviews with the parents. We were playing with the children whilst we were doing that. We also were doing an ADOS, and it was quite a long period of time really, though this was the only bit we were coding where the children really were having to kind of would be inhibiting their behaviour for. So I think that can't be the only explanation. I think a really good explanation is this idea of kind of perception of both parents and carers and teachers. So maybe that the kind of minimally verbal group, people are kind of seeing a lot of these behaviours as, well, that's kind of the autism, when in reality we need to then promote psychoeducation so that people can see that, well, then if children are kind of getting quite upset or quite anxious, this isn't the kind of autism, this is maybe a symptom of a mental health concern like anxiety that these children obviously need kind of support with. And finally, I think this raises the kind of argument of subjective versus kind of objective measurement and the importance of taking a mixed methods approach, because obviously in research now everyone's got quite excited about using objective measurement, which is obviously kind of very important. But again, we shouldn't ignore the experiences of the parents and the teachers and the individuals with autism themselves, because at the end of the day, that's really what kind of matters rather than just kind of what we're seeing for kind of 20 minutes. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Oh, and thank you for all the families that took part. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, really interesting. Any questions for Tom?
Were there any behaviours you were surprised you were noticing significantly more than the parents, or was it kind of just same kind of not difference across the board?
It was quite different. So with the group of children who were kind of currently verbal, what we actually got a lot was parents who actually were quite annoyed, because then they kind of felt like in some ways we were thinking they were lying or something like that, because they were reporting these really extreme kind of behavioural situations at home, and the children were coming in and we were spending hours with them and they were just absolutely perfect and absolutely kind of lovely. That wasn't for every case, but that was kind of something you saw in that group. But it was actually quite upsetting sometimes, more in the minimally verbal group. You really saw how hard it is for, I mean, some parents. I mean, I remember one time this girl, and she was only 4, and she was just wouldn't let go of her mum's hair, and the mum was just like really upset, because obviously it really hurts if someone's pulling on your hair, and it was, you could really see how kind of it was really quite challenging, and that was surprising that when you saw quite how severe it was for kind of some people.
Do you think that part of the reason that they're not rating those behaviours as more extreme is they just kind of adapt and get used to it? So they're kind of thinking, well, that's just kind of normal for us, and it just has to be something even more extreme for them to do.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a possibility that sometimes, you know, when you go into maybe special schools compared to mainstream schools, the perception of what is something that people can handle and is quite typical is very different, isn't it?
Right, any other questions? Yes, Francesca.
Really nice talk. Was there any difference between the two groups in terms of numbers of other siblings?
Off the top of my head, not that kind of really screamed out to me. We're still looking at that in terms of the actual analysis, but I met quite a lot of the families, and there was a lot of variation, I think, in kind of both sides.
We certainly find in our twin studies there's a lot of contrast effects where parents who have twins, if one child has quite easily diagnosed autistic behaviour, the other child gets rated as absolutely neurotypical, even when somebody else wouldn't say they were neurotypical. It's just by contrast with that other twin.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Tom. Okay, so our next speaker, I'm going, where is the next speaker? Do you want to say your name for me? Because I will get it wrong.
Yeah, in Chinese like Cai Xing, but it's fine to call me Cici. Yeah.
Cici.
Yeah.
Thank you, Cici. And Cici is going to tell us about processing of laughter in autistic adults. Thank you, Cici.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the processing of laughter in autistic adult. Okay, so imagine a situation like this. Think back to your teenager's times and a time that when you cannot stop your dad telling a jokes in front of your friends. Okay, something like this. Sorry.
Who is the best kung fu vegetable? Broccoli.
Yeah, a joke like this. Yeah, so what could possibly make you feel slightly better after your dad tells the jokes? That silence or your friends burst out laughing? Okay. So when we talk about laughter, the first things come to our mind is a very positive vocal emotion expression associated with humor and amusement. But actually, laughter is more often to be used as a social signal in our daily life. It plays a very important communicative role in our daily interactions, like showing politeness, affiliation, and agreement to others. Okay, so as a social behavior, laughter is very crucial for us to establish and maintain social relationships. And lots of study has found differences in social processing between neurotypical and autistic people, but none of them examine the processing of laughter as a main focus. So we create an implicit processing task to investigate whether addition of laughter would affect people perceive the funniness of the jokes. And our study has just accepted by current biologists. So actually we recorded 40 pounds jokes, which spoken by professional female comedians. They are all word-playing jokes because studies indicate that neurotypical and autistic people, they are likely to understand the verbal puns. Then we created 2 different pursued random size of jokes and laughs. So you can see from here, half of the jokes was paired with short spontaneous laugh, and half the jokes, the other half was paired with the short pause laughs. So the participants in both experimental groups were closely matched on age, gender, and IQs. They rated the stimuli from either set 1 and set 2. Okay, so here's an example about a stimuli in our set 1.
What is the best day to cook? Friday.
So it's followed by, I will just let you
What is the
tell
best day to cook? Friday.
So it's very easy to tell which one is paired with the real laughter or spontaneous laughter, and which one is paired with the very posed, controlled laughter. Okay. And we also recruit a separate group of neurotypical participants to rate it purely the jokes, establish a baseline rating of the funniness of the jokes. So the whole task is very simple. It's like it contains 40 trials, and after each of the sounds recording, there will be a rating scale showing up on the screen, asking the participant to give a rating of its funniness level. And to assess the effect of additional laughs to the funniness of each individual jokes, we therefore calculated average ratings for each joke across the participants in a group. And you can see 3 things from the result. First, we found the significant differences between the baseline rating and also the jokes plus laughter ratings of the neurotypical adults in respect of type of laughter, which means the additions of laughter modulate the funniness of the jokes. And within the neurotypical group, we find differences, significant differences of the jokes plus the different kinds of laughter, which means that the jokes paired with spontaneous laughter was rated as significantly funnier than the jokes with the posed laughter. Third, we found exactly the same profile on autistic adults as well. So both groups give highest funniest ratings for jokes paired with spontaneous laugh than the jokes paired with posed laughs. This suggests that laughter is being implicitly processed by all participants, not only its presence, but also the kinds of laughter. And more than that, the autistic people, the autistic adults, they rated all the laughter more funniest than the neurotypical people. I think this probably could be the reason that our neurotypical participants, they are more aware that that jokes are uncool and childish. But for the autistic adults, they are more open to such kind of jokes. But unfortunately, we lack of the baseline rating from the autistic adults to see whether they perceive the punch joke in the same way like their neurotypical peers. Okay, so the take-home message here is that actually, as human beings, we cannot ignore the existence of laughter. It's implicit processing by our human beings. And also, it's the same profile on the autistic and neurotypical populations. Okay. And thanks to my supervisors, Sophie Scott, Sarah White, and also Sinead Chen, who create the stimuli. Okay, thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks. Getting the line of the camera. Do you want to take a couple of questions?
Yes.
Okay, so are there any questions for Cece? Yes, go ahead.
What extent some of the acceptance of the joke is masking?
It's masking?
Yeah.
Masking.
What extent the child pretends to
The child pretends, sorry.
So, do you want me to answer this?
Yeah.
I think the fact that when they hear the spontaneous laughter, they rate the jokes as funnier. That's an implicit thing. So I don't think masking. I don't think you can fake that. Can you?
I don't think, actually the laughter stimuli we create is in the acoustic chamber. So the participants are first to be asked to deliberately produce the ha 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 sounds, which is very posed. And they also asked to bring some stimuli, which they know they will produce this kind of spontaneous laugh, like YouTube videos, which they cannot stop laughing with those kind of videos. So that's why we have the two sets of different types of laughter. So it's not act laughter, to be honest, but the post one is definitely the ha 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 sounds. Yeah, because the time limit, so I didn't go details to that stimuli set. Sorry.
Yeah. I think if it was masking, you would expect them to rate them the same way.
you would check the eyes and the mouth synchronicity.
But they're only listening. I don't see this. I don't think
Yeah,
they're saying that.
yeah.
Francesca.
I think it would be really interesting, as you said, to get that baseline judgment.
Yeah.
You could get online data on that.
Actually, I mean, I just finished my testing this year officially yesterday, and we got the baseline rating from those autistic participants. Because in ICN we have a panel autistic database.
Because
yeah.
we don't know without seeing that whether actually
yeah,
laughter,
this
just
is a
any
very
sort
good
of laughter,
question. Yeah. But right now we can only yield the conclusion based on what data we already have. But in the future, I already get the data, but I haven't started analyze yet.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks for sharing dad jokes. Right, Samantha Holt now is going to tell us about a computer-based early social skills intervention for autistic children attending special school. Thank you, Samantha.
Good afternoon, I'm Samantha Holt and I'm a research fellow in the Chat Lab at the University of Sussex and co-investigator on the Connect project. In the Chat Lab, we like to look at ways to use collaborative technology, also called multi-user or shareable technology, to look at ways to help children interact with other people. As many of you know here, for autistic people, having useful speech is key to achieving a good quality of life, such as having friends, a job and living independently. However, 1 in 4 autistic people speak few or no words, and more than a third will also have an intellectual disability. So therefore, it is important to identify ways to encourage autistic children and young people to interact with others that does not require language. In autistic children, language has been found to be consistently related to their ability to engage in joint attention, for example, looking at the same object or event with others, using declarative gestures to share that event or an object, and their ability to imitate another's actions. Significantly, taking part in collaborative activities encourages the use of of these important skills. And in the Chat Lab, our research shows that collaborative technology, in the form of our Connect app, can support children, including those who speak few or no words, to be more aware of their partner, engage in more joint attention, and use more declarative gestures and imitation compared to activities presented using a standard computer setup. So in the Chat Lab, we have developed Connect, an app designed and tested in special schools to support autistic children, including those who speak few or no words, to collaborate on a picture sorting activity. Connect uses Wi-Fi to link 2 iPads. This means that the same picture sorting game can be presented simultaneously on both iPads, and the software is able to place constraints on how players can progress through the activity. And in this way, we can support collaboration. So the Connect constraints here, the main one, is that the children have to agree on where they place the pictures on the grid, either the yellow or the blue sign. And a new picture will only appear when the players show agreement by pressing the We Agree button that you can see in the middle centre of all the iPads. So that if the pictures aren't in matching positions, the We Agree button will flash and shake red, giving the feedback that they're not in a position to receive another picture. Children, or rather the players, are able to freely move pictures around the grid and press their We Agree as many times as they like until they can actually get a new picture. We also in this, we have a game creation platform where content can be personalised by the teachers so that they can be tailored to be developmentally appropriate and engaging for each student. As you can see from the comments at the bottom of the screen, the teachers have found the platform, the app, very easy to use. So the aim of the Connect project is to evaluate Connect as a computer-based early social skills intervention for autistic children attending special school. We are recruiting 40 autistic children and young people, including those who speak few or no words, aged from 4 to 19 years, at special school and their teaching staff. Children will be placed into an intervention or a waiting list group. Both groups will have an early social communication sales, an adaptive version of this, at both the pre and post-test assessments, and the intervention group will also have filmed them pre and post Connect games. The intervention group will then have Connect daily for 5 to 6 weeks in the special school, delivered by the teachers, and the waiting list control will have special school as usual. And then after we've collected the post-test assessments, they will then get their Connect. The waiting list control will then have Connect for 5 to 6 weeks after. So, we selected the ESCS as it uses toys to encourage children to interact with another person and for them to initiate joint attention or behaviour request or social interaction, or to respond to a bid from another person for joint attention, a behaviour request, social interaction, and pointed imitation. These are the early social skills that Connect is aiming to support. So for some children, interaction can be difficult, but not always absent. So will a daily Connect activity build on these existing skills? Children during the assessment have been very focused on the exciting toys, but sharing joint attention was inconsistent. So will any improvement in the early social skills using Connect generalise to the ESCS after the intervention is over? Okay, I think it might be stuck at this point because the film, I have to come out of the... Actually, no, it's completely stuck. Anyone good at computers? Oh, thank you. I'm a Mac user. I don't Control, Alt, Delete. Ah, there we go.
And then go to Task Manager.
Thank you.
And then...
Okay.
And, yeah, then you can turn it off. Yeah.
Right, so here's the film. So here we have an 8-year-old autistic girl and her teacher, and this is the pre-test Connect assessment, and it's the first time that they've been playing Connect together. And as you can see, she's very aware of what her teacher's doing. In this particular game, she has to match and sort the pictures into 2 categories, and she has Tigger and cars, and so they actually aren't the same category. And so her teacher's trying to encourage her to place her picture into the other grid. But what's really important about it is the interaction that is occurring around the game and not the categorisation task. So although the pictures have to be correctly categorised, this isn't about learning about categories. This is about giving the child the opportunity to interact with their partner. As you can tell, he's in a very active special school. But you can see how lovely, how beautifully she was looking as her teacher was moving, the pictures, and also how she would imitate her actions around the game. So I'll just go back into that. So, the Connect assessments will be analysed for other awareness, pre and post test. And I'm afraid I haven't got any of the results on the main study that we're running, but for the small pilot study we did, after 4 to, sorry, I'll just remove that as well from you. Is that on your screen? Yes. Oh, is it gone? Fun technical issues. No, I can't remove it, I'm afraid. So from the pilot study we saw really nice improvement in the increase in the amount of other awareness that includes speech related to the game, imitation and declarative gestures, after 4 to 5 weeks of having Connect every day. The quote from the bottom was actually from the teacher of the participant who has the green line. So you can see initially he had very few interactive behaviours, but she says M likes to be on his own, he likes to do everything on his own, but with the game he did interact, he did talk as much as he was able, it was the most I'd see him talk. I can't make this thing work.
I think that's okay.
I've got all it is. The final slide was just that our aim for the is to if the evaluation of Connect is successful, our aim is to offer it as a social skills intervention into special schools.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
I'll let someone else sort that out.
Stay there. Just
oh,
one
yes,
second.
sorry.
Are you happy to take 1 or 2 questions? Any questions?
Sorry, I'd just like to encourage the thinking of extending that to inpatient mental health units as well. Unfortunately, where we have young people staying for a good 2 to 3 years, which is not ideal, but it does happen, and it's the most complex of young people as well. I think that would be a really good way of young people connecting with each other as part of therapy as well.
We have in other studies actually looked at peer-peer interaction, and it's been very successful actually at being able to encourage peers. We did autistic children working together because often they are in schools together, so you can't bus in some typical developing children to partner them, so it seems very sensible, and that was very effective. In fact, it's something that could possibly, yes, be used by many children, not necessarily all autistic children, but for intellectual disability as well, because it's very clear and easy to use. And we've found it's also been very easy to adapt it on the developmental level, so you can make the picture sorting, so it seems like really simple, but the picture sorting you can actually make complex. And the reason we did the platform is for the very thing that the first speaker, Rebecca, was talking about, is because we recognise how important using what interests the child is if you want to motivate their interest. And so that's why we use the platform, so that there are no games preloaded. It has to be all sort of done by the teacher or whoever might be using it to make it for the child individually.
Brilliant. Any questions on this side of the room? Okay, well thank you very much and good luck with the study. And now for our final talk of the afternoon, Laura Hull. Hopefully we've got PowerPoint to behave itself now. And Laura's going to talk about how camouflaging will affect how an autistic teenager is perceived by non-autistic people. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here and staying with us till almost the bitter end of the afternoon session. I'm going to hope that the presentation works okay, but if not, I'll try and just wing it. So my talk is about the final study in my PhD that I've almost finished which is talking about how camouflaging affects people's perceptions of autistic people. So in terms of communication, we're thinking about sort of broader social communication in terms of your verbal and non-verbal presentation to other people, rather than just looking specifically at language, for example. So as a bit of background, if anyone isn't aware, when we talk about camouflaging, we're talking about strategies which are used by autistic people, whether or not you are aware of using them, which might hide behaviours related to autism and make you seem less autistic during social interactions. So this could be things like forcing yourself to make eye contact if it's not something you would normally want to do, having a script of questions or topics to ask about during a social interaction, mimicking other people, whether that's their body language, the things that they talk about, even the way that they dress or the way that they use their voices and their faces. And another really important aspect of camouflaging is the idea of sort of masking or hiding sensory sensitivities or other behaviours which might mark you out as being different to non-autistic people. So for example, not showing someone that you're experiencing sensory discomfort, because that would kind of show them that you are experiencing the world in a different way to them. And I've just got this lovely image of camouflaging, which is produced for us by an autistic adult, which I think kind of sums up a little bit about the complicated processes that are involved. So there's been quite a lot of research showing that there are some negative consequences of camouflaging. These are just some examples of quotations from a study that we did with autistic adults talking about their camouflaging experiences. So people said that they felt camouflaging was really exhausting, both mentally and physically. They felt it was very isolating because it sort of stops you from making these friendships with people on a really kind of true and meaningful level. It also, as we've heard previously, can stop you getting access to diagnosis and support. And yeah, it just sort of generally can create a lot of problems for someone. And there have been a lot of research showing that camouflaging is associated with various different mental health difficulties, such as anxiety, depression, burnout, suicidal thoughts. So the evidence so far seems to be suggesting that camouflaging is not a very good thing for autistic people to be doing a lot of the time. It creates a lot of problems. So our question was, why do people keep on doing it? You know, if people are recognizing this as something that they don't want to do and it's potentially causing them harm, why do people try and camouflage, even if they're not aware of this? And one of the things that's often been described to us is that camouflaging can really affect the way that you are perceived by other people and therefore treated by them. So if any of you saw Ailey Cage and Holly Burton's talk this morning, we're talking about a very similar idea of social impressions. So this idea of the sort of first judgment that someone forms of you when you interact with them that can then go on to determine how they interact with you in the future and the way that they treat you. And there's been a lot of research showing that autistic people are generally judged more negatively compared to non-autistic people. We also know that a lot of the motivations for camouflaging that autistic adults have described to us are to try and make a better impression on people. So to try and make friends, to avoid being bullying, or to avoid some of the stigma associated with seeming different. So it seems sort of intuitively to us that if people want to achieve successful camouflaging, if this is something that they do want to keep on doing, camouflaging would maybe result in better impressions of you compared to someone who isn't camouflaging, who seems more autistic behaviourally and socially. So that was our idea of what successful camouflaging might look like, and I put successful in quotation marks because we know there are all of these negative consequences, so it's not really a behaviour we would want to promote, but that might be one positive outcome or aim of camouflaging. So that kind of led us to our main research question for this project, which was, does camouflaging actually lead to more positive social impressions formed by others? So most of the research in camouflaging has really looked at how much people think they're camouflaging, or looked at sort of camouflaging in terms of discrepancies across different measures of autistic characteristics, but do people who camouflage more actually kind of make a better impression? That was our main question. And most of the research into camouflaging so far has also focused on autistic adults. There hasn't been very much work in teenagers, but we were really interested in understanding, do autistic teenagers and young people camouflage their autism, and can they maybe report on it in some of the same ways that we've seen adults do? And we weren't sure about this, so we thought we would include a self-report measure of camouflaging for teenagers, and also a parent report version to see whether parents were any good at identifying camouflaging behaviours in their young people. Maybe they identified different behaviours, maybe they actually weren't very good at identifying those behaviours at all. So this was quite an exploratory part of the study. And then another question we had was whether either camouflaging or your social impression are just related to your kind of innate level of social skills. So I think it stands to reason that if an autistic person generally has relatively higher social skills as they might be measured in a sort of clinical setting, they might look less autistic, therefore they might form a better social impression. They might maybe not need to camouflage as much, right? Or you could argue that people who have really good social skills might not need, might use that instead of camouflaging. So we wanted to try and kind of unpick the difference between these different behaviours. Are camouflaging and social skills and social impression the same thing? Are they all different aspects of similar behaviours, but they might be influenced by different things? So those were the sorts of broad questions that we were trying to look at with this study. So our participants for the study and the data is still being collected, so I'm presenting some preliminary findings which will be updated when we get more participants. We included 39 teenagers with a confirmed diagnosis of autism. It was a pretty much 50-50 male-female split. The mean age was 14 years, but we had a range of 13 to 18 years, so we're mostly looking at sort of younger adolescents, but we do include that full range. We included only people who didn't have a diagnosed intellectual disability, but we included people with a whole range of cognitive abilities within that. So we wanted to make sure we weren't including people who just had very, very high cognitive ability in our study. So we asked all of the young people in our study to complete the self-report camouflaging autistic traits questionnaire, or CATQ, which we have developed with and for autistic adults and validated. But we wanted to see whether we can also use it in young people. So this gives you a total camouflaging score where a higher score means you camouflage more. We also asked their parents to complete a parent report version of that, and as you can see, it's pretty much exactly the same as the child report version, but we've changed I statements to my child, so that's the only difference in the questionnaire. And we also asked the parents to complete the social responsiveness scale, the SRS, social cognition index, which is a measure of social difficulties, which again is quite a sort of clinical measure of someone's social skills. And with that, higher scores on that would mean more social difficulties. We then asked the young people to perform a behavioural camouflaging task. So we asked them to talk for about a minute about a holiday that they had been on recently, and we asked them to talk directly to the camera, so it's a sort of first-person perspective, and they were asked to make a really good impression for the camera and be their best social self. So we were trying to elicit some kind of camouflaging, getting them to use strategies that they might typically use, but we didn't want to prescribe exactly how they should do that or how much they should. So we really wanted this to be how much camouflaging these young people might use in their everyday lives. Maybe they don't camouflage at all, maybe they camouflage a lot, and hopefully kind of capture some of that individual variation within the videos. We then gave those videos to undergraduate student coders. We removed any reference to autism, we made sure that the videos were anonymized, and we got them to rate the videos on a score of social impressions, and this is sort of adapted from previous studies looking at social impressions measures. So we asked them to rate them on 6 sort of qualities or traits, so things like are they engaging, are they intelligent, are they likable, and for behavioural intention, so how much would you want to interact with that person, to sit next to them, to have a conversation with them. And we averaged that to give people a mean social impression score, where a higher score means you formed a more positive impression of that person. And each young person had a kind of mean social impression score, which was the average of all of the ratings of their video across the different coders. So what did we find? First of all, we did a correlation analysis just to look at what the different measures of camouflaging, the self-report and parent report, and the social skills measure, how they related to each other. We found that self-reported and parent-reported camouflaging was strongly positively correlated. So that means that if a young person reported that they used more camouflaging strategies, the parent was also likely to report that their child used more camouflaging strategies. So in other words, they're pretty sort of reliable with each other. They both seem to be measuring roughly the same things, but not exactly the same things. What was really interesting is that neither measure of camouflaging was significantly correlated with the young person's level of social difficulties, this SRS score. So in other words, it didn't matter really sort of how much the young person seemed to have high levels of clinician-rated social difficulties. It didn't really affect whether or not they camouflaged. And that was quite surprising, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the implications of that at the end. We then performed a multiple regression analysis, so we wanted to see whether parent-reported camouflaging, self-reported camouflaging, and social skills predict the social impression. and we put all of those together in the model. We also controlled for age and IQ, just in case that those were something that might influence it. And as I said before, we had a sort of pretty much matched gender sample, so we weren't looking at gender differences at this stage. And the only significant predictor of social impressions in this analysis was parent-reported camouflaging. So if parents reported that their children camouflaged more, the children tended to have higher social impression scores. So they were perceived more positively by the non-autistic raters. And interestingly, we didn't see a significant relationship with self-reported camouflaging or with social skills. So I'm going to think a little bit about some of the implications for that now. So as I said, self-report and parent-report camouflaging seem to be identifying similar overall levels of camouflaging, but not exactly the same behaviours. And this suggests that parent-reported camouflaging, as measured with this sort of parent version of the CAT-Q, which we have not validated yet, this is the sort of first test, that might actually be quite a useful tool if young people aren't able to identify or communicate their own camouflaging behaviours. But it's also really important to emphasise that it might not pick up on all camouflaging strategies. So a lot of strategies, particularly these things that I described, like sort of minimising your sensory experiences, that might be something that a parent or an observer isn't going to pick up in that person. So it's important that we still include some kind of self-report measure or self-expression of camouflaging to make sure that we're picking up on all camouflaging behaviours. The kind of main conclusion of this was that teenagers whose parents think they camouflage more make better social impressions. So in other words, camouflaging can be successful if that is one of the kind of aims that autistic adults have said that one of the reasons why they want to camouflage. It does seem to work, at least to some extent, in terms of making connections with others. So if you have a better first impression, you're probably going to be more likely to continue to interact successfully with someone, reduce bullying and stigmatization, and generally sort of be a bit more successful in your social interactions. So camouflaging does seem to be successful in some ways, which explains, I think, why people do it to some extent. But we didn't find this relationship for teenagers' self-reported camouflaging and their social impressions. And there are a few different interpretations of this. So one reason could be that teenagers are reporting camouflaging behaviours that maybe have less of an impact on other people's impressions. So they could be reporting behaviours which they are putting a lot of effort into but aren't actually really influencing other people's perceptions that much. Or they could be less successful. So the CAT-Q, the measure that we used here, is really measuring someone's intention to camouflage. It doesn't measure how successful they are in achieving those goals. So for example, someone might report, I make eye contact with people even though I don't want to, but the person that they're interacting with might actually feel like the person didn't make the amount of eye contact that they were expecting. So it could be that teenagers' estimate of their camouflaging doesn't reflect the impact that their camouflaging has on their behaviour, if that makes sense. That's one interpretation, but it was a really small sample. It was underpowered for the kind of analyses that we wanted to do. We're collecting more data, so hopefully once we get it up to the proper sample, we might actually see a significant relationship there. So as I said, it's a preliminary analysis. I don't want to say for certain one way or the other whether or not self-reported camouflaging in teenagers is related to social impression, but this is what we found so far. And then finally, another really sort of interesting and quite surprising result was that social skills aren't related to either camouflaging or social impression, really. So in other words, people who have kind of clinically assessed poor social skills can still camouflage. So that means that they're also therefore at risk of some of the mental health difficulties that might be associated with camouflaging. But they can also still make sort of good impressions, or at least the impressions that they make aren't influenced by their level of social skills. So again, that's maybe challenging some of the ideas around, do we need to really focus on interventions for people's social skills if that's not necessarily the thing that's having a big impact on their impression on others? So kind of some reflections of the overall study. As I said, the sample's really small. We're collecting more data, and we also want to analyse it between genders once we have some more participants. We don't really have a sense of how much the young people were camouflaging during this behavioural task. And that's because there isn't really a way to measure camouflaging behaviourally yet. No one's quite figured out how to look at someone and say, this is how much you're camouflaging, without knowing that person really well. So we need to develop more ways to do that, to try and understand how much people who can't sort of report their own camouflaging behaviours, whether we can still get a sense of how much they are really camouflaging. Our sample, although it was a pretty good match sample in terms of gender, it doesn't generalise to a lot of other countries or autistic people who have other identities that might affect the way that they present themselves to others. So, for example, individuals with intellectual disability, those who communicate through other methods, and our sample was also mostly white and mostly spoke English as their first language. So, as we've heard before, if we're thinking about different languages being spoken or different ethnic and cultural influences in there, those are all going to affect the way that you present yourself to others, and that needs to be taken into account. And then I want to finish with a kind of broader thought, which is, if we think that the motivation for camouflaging and camouflaging being successful is removing this stigma associated with being autistic, if we try and reduce some of the stigma and some of the attitudes to looking autistic in non-autistic environments, we might actually reduce the need to camouflage quite a bit. So I just want to say thank you very much for everyone who took part, thank you to all my collaborators, and thank you all for listening.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one quick question. Anyone have a question? Yes.
Hi, Dora, thanks for bringing the talk. I was quite interested in the lack of relationship you found between social skills and your camouflaging. And I wondered, just try and pack that a bit more, like, do you think perhaps that if you have good social skills, perhaps your camouflaging is perhaps on an unconscious level because it's so good that you're maybe not actually able to kind of consciously report the strategies that you're using?
Yeah, I think that's definitely an explanation. So sort of it could be that people who have poorer social skills kind of need to camouflage more and do it a bit more effortfully in order to achieve these outcomes, and people who might have more innate social skills, like you said, they might be kind of doing this a little bit more intuitively, so it wouldn't come out in a self-report measure. I think what we'd really like to do if we have more data is sort of unpack it at different levels of social ability and try and look within the sample to see if there's some variation there.
Brilliant. Okay, so I want to say thank you to all of our speakers. It's been quite an eclectic mix of talks, but all very thought-provoking. And to thank all of you for listening and for your wonderful questions. I particularly want to thank Kirsten, who did a phenomenal job of keeping people to time, so we can all go and have a cup of tea now on time. So thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.